Hey everybody, Scott here. Hope you're having a great day. I'm going to try something new today. I'm going to review a couple of videos that are predicting a 2023 housing crash, and I'm going to show you why I think they're not accurate. A couple pieces of data I think they are misinterpreting or just cherry picking. Don't want to slam any of these guys. Everybody has their own opinion, but I think a couple of these guys are just wrong. And I picked guys that I think are trying to do this on the up and up and ethically. Lots of times you see these videos and you can tell, hey, this guy's predicting the market crash because he's still living in his mom's basement and needs to buy a house and he can't unless it crashes. Or they're selling some big package of how you can buy houses when the market crashes. And so they're selling you on the fact it's going to crash so they can sell you a $500 system to make money when it does crash. I'm not using any of those guys. So this is just guys that are doing it straight. I think they're coming at it honest, but I think I can point out some things they're missing. So first guy I want to look at is a guy named RJ Talks. He reviewed Morgan Stanley's report on the real estate market for 2023. He's got almost 12,000 subscribers, and he's definitely worth a subscription. So I just think he's made a couple of mistakes here. So let's take a look at this.
Housing bust, not all of which I agree with, but it's still good information to be made aware of. So check this out. With the combination of record home price growth and an increase in mortgage rates that we haven't experienced since the early 1980s, it's led to affordability deteriorating at the fastest pace in the history of our data. This has contributed to existing home sales falling faster than they did during the Great Financial Crisis. Let's read that again. This has contributed to existing home sales falling faster than they did during the Great Financial Crisis, which you can see here.
Okay, now he's correct here, but look at what he's saying. He's saying contributed existing home sales falling faster. So they fell faster, but they are still higher than they were during the Great Financial Crisis. So we are still selling more homes than we did during the financial crisis, but the drop happened a lot faster because rates shot up so quickly. So yes, it fell faster, but we're overall in a better position in terms of demand right now than we were during the financial crisis. So let's continue.
Here. Now keep in mind, these reports take them months to prepare. This report is over 100 pages and was published a few weeks ago. So home sales falling faster they're talking about. Well, it's not just home sales that are falling significantly faster than they did back in '06, but also home prices, which is why we are most definitely in the middle of a housing crash right now. Because when you compare the worst year of the last housing bust, 2006, to what we're experiencing right now, it's not even close. After the market imploded in '06, the fastest home prices fell in a single year was 12.7%. Right now, from peak to trough, from June through the end of January, we're already down 11% nationally, according to the NARs.
Okay, here's his first real mistake. He's cherry picking data. He talks about the largest full year decrease in prices during the crash being, I think he said 12.7%. My data showed it was 13%. And then he notes that in the last 6 months of 2022, we fell 12%. And therefore that pace is a lot faster than a 12-month pace of the same drop. But here's what he didn't say. The first 6 months of 2022, we were up 12%. So if you look at the 12-month data, we're actually exactly even. Came down 12% after rising 12%. We just had our drop a lot faster than we did back during the housing crisis. And that was because if you were around in their housing crisis, that slowly evolved. Not everybody did a short sale at once. It built up over time. So it took longer for it to drop. 2022, the Fed jacked rates up and our market hit a wall. So it happened all of a sudden. What you really need to look at is what's going to happen in the future. Now I'm on the West Coast. January's kind of leveled out. And I think in my market in particular, I think Friday, in my market in particular, I think in February, we're actually going to go up. So let's continue here.
So 12.7% to 11% right now, 11% in 7 months, annualized, we blow right past that 12.7% number. Now, they go on to talk about inventory being extremely low levels and how it's most likely going to impact home sales in 2023. They say, while demand is down, so is supply. Overwhelming majority of the mortgage market today is fixed rate, with most of those fixed for 30 years. A lot of those borrowers bought their home or were able to refinance their mortgage at the record low mortgage rates of the past few years, which we know. These homeowners are locked in at that current rate and are much less likely to list their home for sale. We can see this manifesting in the number of existing homes that are being listed for sale, which remain close to 40-year lows. And you can see that right here. Starting right in 2020, home prices and inventory inverted, bringing active inventory on the market to the lowest level we saw since the early 1980s. So if people aren't selling their homes, it means they also aren't buying a home on the follow. He says, we think that this dynamic will lead to existing home sales continuing to fall at a steeper pace than what we experienced during the great financial crisis through the middle of 2023, and expect single unit sales to still fall from 4.94 million today to 4.23 million, the lowest since 2013, which, if true, means housing demand will continue to stay severely low until the middle of 2023, basically at depression type levels until midsummer. Now, here's where they start getting into home prices and their predictions. This lack of inventory should provide support to home prices, as will robust lending standards, which we think will keep the volume of defaults and foreclosures under control. During the great financial crisis, the steepest that home prices ever fell in a 12-month period was 12.7%, which we just said. It took a significant amount of distressed selling through defaults and foreclosures to achieve that amount of annual home price decline. So listen to this. By our estimate, distressed transactions eclipsed 30% of monthly sales volumes at their great financial crisis peaks. That's a lot of bad debt, folks. More than 30% of all home sales during that period were distressed mortgages. In this cycle, lending standards have remained more conservative. In fact, during the around 40% run-up in home prices since March 2020, lending standards have actually tightened. While home prices were climbing during the early 2000s, lending standards were easing substantially. Now, this is important. Check this chart out. What Ben is saying is that a key difference, which we all realize, but when you see it on this chart, it really brings it home.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. What he has done over the last couple of minutes, and you can go watch his video, is he's shown the difference between 2008 and 2022, 23, whereby housing standards got a lot looser, which is what he's pointing to up here. And that's what actually led to the bust. Too much easy money, too many of what we called liar loans at the time. Whereas he says down here, right, as you hit 2020 and the pandemic, lending standards got tighter, which means you have a better quality of borrower. Okay, so basically we had everybody up here was buying their third, fourth, and fifth house with nothing down. Down here we had people who were still buying their primary residence with 20% down. So he made that case very well, and then he just seems to ignore it and not think that's a big deal, and that's a very big deal. Let's continue here.
Opposite scenario took place between 06's bubble and our current housing bubble. Now, these two housing bubbles have, different busting catalysts. As you just saw, the catalyst for the 06 bubble bursting was the outstanding level of distressed debt, whereas our current housing bubble popped due to extreme unaffordability brought on by home prices and higher mortgage rates, which you...
Okay, he's prejudiced already in his concept here. He's saying the housing crash bubble and the current bubble. Housing crash bubble markets fell 45%. Real estate was distressed for several years. In the last 18 months prior to last May, we were up 45% in our market. That's huge. We're now down 12%, and this is nationwide. That is not a bubble popping. A 45% rise in 18 months followed by a 6 months drop at 12% is a correction. So just because you're seeing the market fall 12%, we're still way above where we were pre-pandemic. So I think it's incorrect sitting here now calling it a housing bubble that's burst. It has not popped. We've seen a slight correction.
You can see illustrated right here. What this chart shows is just how unaffordable it is right now to purchase a house. Even with home prices coming down 11%, doesn't matter because it's even more unaffordable today than it was where you see on this chart. And that is due to the increase in rates that took place from March of last year to today. So different catalysts. Current housing boom busted due to unaffordability. 06 housing boom busted from extreme levels of distressed debt. And what...
Okay, let me point something out here because he's made a point without realizing it. Very different catalysts. 2006, 2007, extreme amount of distressed debt. We had people losing their homes, people losing their marriages, people losing everything over the housing crash because people who were not qualified, overstretched, purchased houses they could not afford. Our slowdown right now is caused by rising rates. The Fed has raised interest rates to put a clamp on inflation. Back in the housing bust, the housing crisis, nobody knew when it was going to end. There was no end in sight. Builders gave back options they had on houses. You couldn't have given away some of the houses that were for sale because people watched their parents lose everything and they didn't want anything to do with real estate. The psychology was very different. Today, this is interest rate driven. Most people in today's market, they've been around for 14 to 15 years, they think rates are going to go back down to 4% from 5.5 or 6. So there's optimism. You've got complete fear, apathy, nobody wanting to be in the real estate market during the bust. Right now, you've got people going, hey, I can't afford a house. But it's not investors. It's individual people now wanting a house for their family, looking at 6% interest rates and saying, hey, when it's down to 5, I'm in. So the psychology of the buyers is 100% different. And that's one thing that I don't think he can realize just because he wasn't around back then. But let's keep going.
What the report goes on to say is that taking all of this into account, we believe that year-over-year home price growth will fall 4% by the end of December 2023. The negative headline associated with this number is that home prices would be down 10% from their local peak in June 2022. All right, so Morgan Stanley's prediction then is by year-end, home prices will have fallen 10% from peak to trough, from June through the end of December 2023, the end of this year. Now, keep in mind, this analysis, is forecasting based on where the S&P Case-Shiller will put home prices, which we all know lags by 3 months. The last thing he says, though, is the positive takeaway is that home prices would only be back to Q4 2021 levels, up almost 30% from March 2020 at the onset of the bubble forming. So obviously, I completely disagree with that. I don't find that to be a positive takeaway whatsoever.
Okay, I got to disagree with him here. He's saying, let's look at what we're talking about. Market that went up 45% is going to go down 10%. Morgan Stanley is saying that from the onset of the pandemic, basically, let's go March of 2020, even January 2020, through the end of 23. So you got 4 years. They're saying in that 4-year period, we're going to have a 30% increase in housing prices, and he's calling that a crash. He obviously wasn't around during 2008. That was a crash.
Anyways, Morgan Stanley's forecast is now similar and in line with the other big banks. They're all forecasting around a 10% home price drop by the end of 2023 with some minor distinctions. Now, is this report something to take to the bank? Absolutely not, but it's important to get perspective from all sides. And I do think when this crash is all said and done, it is safe to assume most markets will have fallen back to pre-housing bubble price levels, which will probably take until the end of 24 to early 25. So about 2 more years or so. And the reason I think that is because the Fed can't hit their 2% inflation target without that happening. And they'll start to see housing fall in the CPI in Q2, but it won't fall enough to allow any substantial change to their monetary policy. A lot of people foolishly seem to wait on
Okay, I'm going to stop it right here because he gets a little long trying to make a point, and I'm going to summarize it very quickly. He's saying that the Fed has a 2% inflation target and that they're not going to bring interest rates down until they get to 2%. And with interest rates staying high, there's no way for affordability to increase and people to come into the market. Well, I think the point he's missing is, yes, housing is a large part of the inflation number, but it's year over year. So it really contributed as it was running up. But now that it's leveled off, come down a little bit, it's no longer contributing to inflation except on an equivalent rent level. So if our prices stay where they are from now to the end of the year, that'll be zero inflation from housing. We don't need to see housing drop 40% to bring the inflation number down because inflation is measured year over year. We're not going back to 2020 and saying inflation's up 12% or 7%. When they're quoting 7% inflation, they're quoting it versus 12 months ago. So we don't need housing to fall to bring that down. And so he actually predicts that we're not going to hit the bottom of this till 2024, 2025. And I think that he's just wrong. But he did do some strong analysis. I just think he missed a couple points. All right, let's go to the next video.
For 41 straight months, housing prices in the United States went up during this incredible run that started shortly before the event.
Okay, so this video is by M.H. Finn. So I'm not really sure who these guys are, but I really had trouble with this video too. So let's just take a quick look.
Housing prices in the United States went up. During this incredible run that started shortly before the events of 2020, the situation for buyers quickly became a nightmare. At every point where it was believed that prices were simply too high, the market punished shoppers and rewarded speculators. From February 20...
Now, this is true to a point. The market was crazy and it punished shoppers, but I didn't see it rewarding a lot of speculators. Most of the people I saw buying houses were people buying for themselves. You got to remember, once the pandemic hit, our international market died, right? Nobody was coming from China. Nobody was coming from Taiwan, any place to buy houses. Everybody was quarantined. So demand fell largely because the investors who would be speculating from out of the country didn't come in. We did have a lot of flippers flipping, and they made a lot of money because the market was going up. But most of the market, the final use of the houses, whether it was a flipper that bought it first, was to a family after the flipper fixed it, or the family bought it themselves. So I didn't see speculators in the market this time around.
2019 to June 2022, prices on the national level, according to the Case-Shiller Index, jumped 51%. This massive, never-before-seen leap in values changed everything we know about real estate. In some cities like Seattle, for example, the situation was even worse. Their values in the same time frame jumped over 100%. This era of incredible growth, greed, and speculation caused millions of Americans to begin questioning the health of the market. Were we seeing the development of another super bubble similar to what we saw in the early 2000s? And was this evidence that soon another crash is on the horizon? These questions are debated daily on YouTube, Wall Street, and various other platforms that are full of people on both sides. We can speak about evidence from each perspective for hours, but at the end of the day, there is one simple chart that tells the story better than anything I have ever seen presented. And it's this: the Case-Shiller Index filtered...
Okay, this gentleman makes his presentation based on this one slide, and this is Case-Shiller's home price index, which is a very accurate home price index. It measures it differently than anyone else I've worked with, but he's going to make a mistake here and say that you can break this into multiple segments that repeat themselves. You can't say a pattern in chart analysis repeats itself for the same reason unless you understand the reasons, and he doesn't go into that, and that's what he's missing here.
The Case-Shiller Index filtered by year-over-year change. This infamous chart tracks prices nationally going back to 1987 and reveals everything you need to know about real estate in America. Take any point on this line, and what it shows is how much higher or lower home prices were compared to 1 year ago. For example, in December...
Okay, once again, you caught him there saying this shows everything you need to know about housing prices. Wrong. This shows you what the price is. It doesn't show you anything about why the price is.
1997, home prices were around 4% higher than December 1996. Now, why is this chart so important? Well, it paints the history of the market for the last 35 years, and we can divide this story into 5 distinct parts that tend to repeat themselves. The first is the early 90s collapse, a period of home value decline. This was the infamous regional crash, or as Reventure calls it, the hidden crash. In some markets like LA, prices declined as much as 25%. It's not talked about much, but the US also had a small recession during this period, and it ended sometime around January of 1992. From here, the market underwent its golden age. For 13 years, we had steady growth, the economy expanded, and home prices went higher. Sometime in the early 2000s, greed started pouring into the real estate sector, with speculators, investors, loan officers, agents, and builders all jumping on this train that had been printing money for over a decade. What we saw was the formation of a bubble, massive jumps in value that raised eyebrows all over the country. Sometime around September 2005, the train derailed and the long crash began, lasting all the way till May 2012. This 7-year period of trouble was called the Big One, the Great Financial Crisis, a period where nobody wanted anything to do with real estate. Then from 2012 till about April 2022, we saw what was the Great Recovery. Similar to what happened in the early 90s period, we saw home prices slowly go up. Then as things got better and better, more and more people jumped on the bandwagon. Once again, speculators, investors, loan officers, agents, and even social media trends this time around turned to real estate as a steady, foolproof way to get rich. Led by the...
Okay, his description doesn't describe this period at all. He talks about how it's going up, And more people were jumping on the bandwagon, which would mean it would keep going up, going to get rich, and it actually kind of fell through here. It was a very choppy market. We had some ups and we had some downs, but it wasn't a period of great enthusiasm with a lot of people jumping into the market.
The events of March 2020, this train found a new gear. Just as the early 2000s saw price growth jump to record levels, the early 20s saw the same but to an even higher degree, at one point reaching 20.7% year-over-year growth. The market was euphoric. There was no way anybody could lose money, and buying a house was the easy way to get rich. Every property from distress to luxury became a printing press. It didn't matter where you were, from Columbus to San Francisco and everywhere in between, real estate was rising and nobody was stopping it until May of 2022. That month, the market hit its first road bump. The decline had started. In May of 2022, year-over-year growth reversed, headed straight down. Now, after 7 consecutive months of declines, experts began to wonder if we are in a new phase of the market, another crash phase. How is something that looks eerily similar to this not going to result in this? That is the question everyone is trying to answer. We all know that everything in economics is a cycle, and
it's very simple because we have different drivers. As we discussed when we watched the last video, this was caused by loose lending standards, over speculation, easy money, and people buying a bunch of investor properties with nothing down. This was caused by the Fed raising rates to fight inflation. Completely different. This was greed-driven. Regulators took their hands off everything. People wanted to make it more affordable for people who were disadvantaged to buy houses, even if they didn't really qualify and have the means to pay for them. The end was a disaster, as many people predicted, as that was going on. This is caused by the Fed. Very different set of drivers.
Right now, we look to be in a transition phase similar to what we saw in late 2005. These long cycles of the past have all followed the same exact pattern: a crash followed by a slow recovery, followed by yet another round of greed, and then back to a crash, a cycle that has been accelerated by various forms of leverage. However, many claim that this time it's different, and I understand their point. The main argument is inventory. From their perspective, there just aren't enough homes for sale to cause declines like the ones we saw in 2008. If you listen to the bulls, their story is that following the demand shock of 2020, there just isn't enough for sale signs to produce falling prices, and besides that, lending standards have improved, along with the fact that most people are sitting on homes with mortgage rates under 3%, and those people aren't moving anytime soon. So why do I think otherwise? Well, besides this cycle theory that I just showed you, there is another story, one that isn't being reported on the news, in the media, or by any expert. But before I reveal it, please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the content thus far. As I make this video, I'm sitting at 149,000 subscribers, and I would love to hit that 150 mark before the end of the month. Now, back to what I was saying. You see, right now, if you look at national statistics, they show you that inventory is indeed low, but with an asterisk. It is low, but rapidly rising. In my last video, I explained how if we continue to have the same type of growth in the inventory that we saw last year, we will end 2023 close to 2019 numbers, which was commonly accepted as a normal inventory level. Now, if you watch my channel, you already knew this, but there is something else that isn't being discussed that is changing the way experts look at these national inventory numbers. On the surface, there is no denying that right now active listings do appear rather tight, but what is actually happening on the ground is very different. But before I explain, we need a quick history lesson. If we go back to the last crash, the crash of '08, you can see that there is always a few cities that get hit extra hard. In the last crash, it was cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas. Now, besides the fact that the values in these areas went down further than the national average, it also meant that the decline started earlier. That is to say that these hyped up areas act as the canary in a coal mine for the rest of the country. They're often hit first before the trouble spreads elsewhere, and when the trouble ends, they find themselves with more damage than elsewhere. Now, let's apply.
Okay, he's right here, and without going to where he's going at, let me just describe why. Phoenix and Las Vegas are both big destinations for people in California who are leaving when prices get too high. So that's why whenever you see prices spike, people in California, hey, I made my $500,000 on my house, I'm going to go buy something for cash in Phoenix or Vegas. Or they're just like, hey, I've been renting. There's no way I can buy. I'm going to Phoenix or Vegas because I can afford it. That, coupled with the fact that building standards are a lot easier there than in other parts of the country. When that wave of people starts moving, the builders go out there, they buy the land, which is flat, it's sand, it's easy to build on, and they just put up houses like crazy. So you get a flood of demand, which drives supply because people are trying to get rich on the builder side. And when it turns around, builder cycle can be 2 years from permits to pouring the foundation to grading to construction to selling. If you've got a year and a half worth of stuff in inventory and process and the market turns, that inventory keeps building. And that's why Phoenix and Vegas always get clobbered when we turn south.
This concept to what is happening right now. Today, in 2023, while the national Case-Shiller index is down, there are plenty of cities where prices are flat, barely budging from the 2022 highs. And these cities are almost exclusively found on the East Coast and Midwest. Look at any of the countrywide price graphs and you see that price drops have already begun on most of the West Coast, but in the East and Midwest, things look no different than in 2022. What we have is a story of two sides, East versus West. And this difference.
And I think what you have here, and one of the reasons you have this, is prices on the West Coast shot up a lot faster during the pandemic than they did on the East Coast. Could be lots of reasons for this, but the bottom line is they did. We saw just huge growth. San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco didn't see as much growth on the East Coast. East Coast kind of caught up later, but they did not have as far to fall, and that's why you obviously saw the drop first on the West Coast.
May explain why San Francisco has seen price drops already over 10%, while Cleveland has only fallen 1%. To try and understand why this is happening, I did a small experiment. I took data from Realtor.com and combined the active listing counts from 5 of the biggest cities in the West and 5 of the biggest cities in the East and compared the two. What I found is wild. There is a massive divergence happening with inventory surging in the West while it lags in the East. You can see that from this chart that while the West Coast, which is the orange line, has seen inventory fall over 34% since January 2020, the blue line, which is the East Coast, has seen inventory fall over 63% in that same period. That is a massive divergence that isn't being reflected well in the national average. You can tell from this graph that these numbers.
Okay, I'm not going to speak to the East Coast here because I don't know the East Coast, but the West Coast, if you're picking 5 cities to target on the West Coast, you're probably picking San Francisco or the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, maybe Portland and Seattle. There's a lot of things that happen in those cities that caused inventory to rise. San Francisco has seen a huge homeless problem. Plus, it is so crowded that with the work from home things, you got a lot of people that just left, moved to Lake Tahoe, moved to other places because they could work remotely. Same with Los Angeles. Huge homeless crisis. It's just a pit if you drive through there. I was driving through downtown San Diego 6 months ago, and I was shocked at how bad San Diego has gotten in just the last 4 years. Portland and Seattle, no strangers to political unrest and strife. People are leaving those areas. If you're cherry picking 5 cities on the West Coast, those are the cities I think you're picking, and they're down for a reason. It doesn't necessarily with the housing market. It's driven by other factors.
Numbers for the past 7 years have almost always followed each other in near perfect fashion. Divergence is rare, and when it does happen, what we tend to see is that the East Coast catches up to the West Coast. This was the case in 2018 and 2019 when the West Coast inventory was nearly 20% higher. My belief is that the inventory rise will now begin to spread from these hyped up West Coast cities to the rest of the country, and when we see that, we're going to get the blue line catching up to the orange line. In fact, if the West Coast follows the same trajectory as 2022, what we're going to see is this. By the end of this summer, inventory in the West will rise above 2020 numbers, matching, even exceeding pre-pandemic inventory.
Okay, the other thing that could happen here that we are actually seeing, at least I'm seeing this in the San Diego market, is inventory is falling. So those lines may converge not because East Coast inventory rises, but because West Coast inventory falls. Now, I can't speak to San Francisco and Los Angeles. I haven't dove into those markets, but in San Diego, our inventory is down 5 months in a row. So if that's indicative of the rest of the state or the region, you're going to see those lines converge just because inventory is falling on the West Coast. Now, here's the other point that he glosses over, and he's talking about a huge increase in inventory. And I want to give you some numbers here. This is nationwide. January of 2023, there were 980,000 existing homes on the market. So he's talking about it rising back to 2020 levels. Well, that was about 1.3 million. So that is a big increase. That's a 30% increase in inventory. However, July of 2007 was where we peaked, right in the middle of the last crisis, 3.86 million. So he's worried about inventory rising to pre-pandemic levels, which is still 3 times lower than it was during the crash. You can't compare a market where you've got the same demand and 3 times the supply to where we are now. So be very careful whenever you hear anybody say inventory is rising at a 50% or 30%. We're coming from historical lows, people, and even if it rises to normal levels, we will be 3 times below what we were during the housing crash. So while I think you may see these lines converge because of supply falling in the West Coast, so I want to now address the 2 factors that I think will determine that we're not having a crash. And those are elasticity and desire. Elasticity refers to how much the market moves in relation to prices. Prices here are interest rates. And the demand side, buyer side, is much more elastic than the supply side. On the supply side, anybody who bought a house more than 6 months ago locked in a rate at 3%, 3.5%, or under. That's going back 20 years. If you bought a house 20 years ago, you refinanced it when rates hit 3%. If you're in a home at 3% and you're looking at rates at 6%, you can't buy the equivalent home in most cases. And even when rates go from 6.5 to 6, that doesn't help. 5.5 doesn't help. 5 doesn't help. You're locked in at 3%. You're not going to buy an equivalent house at 5% unless you came into inheritance. So rates going from 6.5 to 6 to 5.5, 5, 4.5, that's not going to move the supply market. On the demand side, you got people out there, newly formed families, you've got divorces, you've got all types of situations, job moves, where they've been looking at 6.5%. When rates fall to 6%, we saw a huge uptick in demand just in a 2-week period. We go back to multiple offers, stuff over asking price. If you're looking for a house at a 6% interest rate and rates go to 5.5%, you can buy a lot more house. So buyers are going to come back to this market a lot faster than sellers are. So you're going to see inventory stay low. The second factor works together with the elasticity, and that is desire. In 2007, we had no demand. Right now, it looks like we have no demand. But in 2007, we had no desire. Nobody wanted to get anywhere near real estate to watch their parents get wiped out, family, friends. You were going to start a family and say, hey, honey, let's go buy a house and get wiped out. You're going to, let's rent, see what happens, and we'll do something later. Not so now. The housing market became unaffordable because of interest rates. Buyers know interest rates will change and it will come back down to them and they can buy. Buyers want to buy houses. They can't afford them. As rates come down, they will be able to afford them. They will jump into the market and that will drive things up. Keep prices elevated. And actually, I'm filming this in the middle of February in San Diego, and I'm predicting that in February, we will see in our market an increase in prices of 2 to 3% for attached and detached homes. For us, it's already turned. Now, can this change? Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff going on in Russia. We've got some huge supply chain issues. If China gets involved, you're talking about a lot of cheap stuff that comes from China not being available for any of us. We'll see some huge inflation. Huge inflation means people can't pay as much rent. That'll have a cascading effect. But as we sit today, with what we know about the market, there are no drivers that are driving this into a crash. If you think differently, I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And I don't know if you noticed, but these 2 guys who did a great job, they've got 10,000, 150,000 subscribers. I'd love to get to 50. So if you could smash that like button and subscribe, I'd love it. Thanks a lot and have a great day.